Hey guys, so as part of today's topic we'll be going over Sitecore dynamic placeholders, and we will see like how it is different than the regular placeholders, and we'll also see like what are the scenarios where like we should go for where we can actually use static placeholders, and the use cases where like we have to go for dynamic placeholders. So let's consider a very simple use case where we have a one column layout. So let's say uh, we have a page, then that page has an header, then it has a footer, and then it has a body section. And inside body section you can think of like it has we have basically integrated a one column layout, and then inside that one column layout we have one placeholder, and that placeholder is like a generic placeholder, and we can use that placeholder to add as many components we want, right? So if I go if I have to show you, then you can think of like this is our standard, right? Then this is a very basic layout file which I have here. So we have a top placeholder, then we have center placeholder, and then we have a bottom placeholder, right? So this is what we have on the layout file. And the use case which I was talking about, like we have a one column frame, right? And that one column frame has, it's a container which has a main content placeholder. So what this does is like let's say if you have to configure, let's say if you have a very basic article page which has header, footer, and then main body, then what we can do is we can use this standard layout, standard CSS HTML as a layout, and then we can use PS top to configure your header, then we have PS bottom to configure your footer, and then we can use this PS center directly. Or in case if you want to if you want to have some kind of wrapper defined for this PS center, then what we can do is we can have a separate section or frame, which in this case what I have done is we have a separate frame created for that, and then inside this frame you can have as many wrappers you want, whatever you want to define there, you can do that. And then in this section or frame you can have your second level placeholder, right? Placeholder key you can define there, and then finally you can use your ph main content to configure as many models you want. So this is the use case number one, which is very pretty straightforward, and there is no issue, absolutely no issue with this kind of approach. So in this case ultimately what happens is you have your header, you have your footer, and then you configure your one column frame to your center placeholder, and then finally in order to configure what different modules you have onto your page, you can finally use ph main content to add as many components you want and any number of times. So that was the recap. Second use case which I really want to talk about is let's take an example where we are talking about a generic page, right? And that generic page is we can consider that that generic page is having a two column layout. So when we talk about two column layout, so we can just again we can think about, we have a page, it has an header, it has footer, and then on the body section we have left hand side component we have, and then we on the right hand side also we can have some more components added to that. So in this case, if we before we talk about even dynamic placeholder, let's see the problem which we are going to face if we go with this kind of approach, right? If so what I'm going to do here is let me go to Sitecore, and then this is a old instance which I have. Normally I use it for my testing. So what I'll do is I'll just create another page. I have a few more pages created there, so let me just create page 3, right? So this is a very generic page template which I have created. Now from here, if I go to publish and experience editor, so yeah, before that opens, let me just show you the presentation also of that generic page template. Okay, still it's loading, so let's just give it a minute. So it's basically there is nothing fancy on this presentation. It's very basic presentation which what we have there. We have header, then we have footer, and then we have, you know, on center placeholder we have configured our 2 column, and that 2 column frame or section has again 2 more placeholders on it, left and right. So yeah, meanwhile let me just show you how that placeholders look. So we have this 2 column frame where we have, you know, placeholder and then another placeholder with the key left and right on it. So this is pretty basic placeholder. Let's see what's going wrong here. It's still loading. Okay, yeah, so the page is now open. So now if you see, like, we have these two we have, you know, we have these two components, which is the default component. Now let me just see, like, let's say if we want to add another 2 column layout, and then for that 2 column layout again, if you want to have 2 more components added to that, right? So what I can do, so before that let me just show you how the presentation looks. So if I go to final layout, so we have header, we have footer, right? So we have header, we have footer, and then we have the, I was talking you I mentioned before that we have this PS center, and then for this PS center basically we can have either your your section or a frame kind of stuff. So that's the reason I have this 2 column frame configured to your PS center placeholder. And if we go to your 2 column frame, then that frame again has 2 more placeholders left and right. So this is basic, right? So now from this point, let's say, so this is fine, right? So I can see we have 2 column frame here, and then on the left hand side also we have one component, on the right hand side we have another component. So now let's take an example. We want to add one more a 2 column frame, right? So that I can have two column layout for my another section also, and I want to add 2 more components there. So with this approach, if we go, so let me just go to my PS center, and then let me add one more 2 column frame there, or section, whatever you want to call it. So once I selected 2 column frame, now you can see as soon as I added another 2 column frame, I get the same data source here, right? So know more about our packages offers was what we had from the first section, or from the first 2 column frame. And as soon as I added the second 2 column frame, I got the same data source. Now from this point, if let me just save this thing and go, let's go to presentation. Let me just refresh it, doesn't make any sense. So if I go to page 3, presentation details, and if I go to final layout, so right, so if you see in the final layout, what we just have another section got added, which is a 2 column frame. So right, anyways, we already had header 2 column frame, RTF again for the left and for the right, and then footer as in bottom placeholder for that. But as soon as I added another section, that is 2 column frame here, I get these things, but there is no change on the data. So it is still auto populating the same old data source which is there before as well. But this is not something which we're really looking for, right? What we are really looking for is we need a flexibility wherein, like, as soon as we add another frame, another section, that section we should be able to add different kinds of components with different data source. So it's not necessary that whatever components we have added in the previous section, we will add those components again and again. So we need a flexibility to add different sections, and then add different kinds of components with a different data source as well. So in this specific case, if you see, because in this specific case where Sitecore is failing on in terms of placeholder mapping is, like, Sitecore is not able to map that for which placeholder, for which component and which placeholder it should get mapped, right? So that kind of mapping is something which is missing in this specific model. So now, in order to fix this issue, what we can really do is Sitecore actually introduced a concept of Sitecore, dynamic placeholder, which is now integrated with Sitecore 9, which is now out of the box. So what we can do is we can, instead of using the regular placeholder, we can replace this with dynamic placeholders. So what happens is, in case, let's say if we have something very static, right? So as I mentioned, my first use case was very static in nature, where I added like one header, footer, and then one big content, and inside that content only I would just keep on adding other components, right? Because it was very basic. But now in the use case which we have taken next, it had a different section or different frame, and under that frame itself we are looking for some kind of flexibility to add different data source item, and the frame also we should be able to duplicate. So it's not like that frame, let's say if you have used 2-column frame once in a page, we are not able to use that 2-column frame second time in the same page with a different data source, right? So we should still have that flexibility, that we should be able to add the already existing frame into the page again with different data source for different components. So that is what we are looking for, and that is the problem which is solved by Sitecore dynamic placeholders. So now what happens is, in this case, we can just change this with dynamic placeholder. Okay, and let me replace this with this, and then let's go to standard. And then what I'm going to do is, I'm also going to change my center placeholder with a dynamic placeholder, so that, because ultimately the frames which I'm going to add, that frame, I'll be, in order to basically inject that frame, I'll be using PS center. So, and there would be multiple frames which I want to add into my page, so that's the reason I want to have this dynamic placeholder for PS center, so that even the center can also be duplicated. So now once we have these changes here, so now my PS center placeholder is also dynamic placeholder, and my 2-column frame is also dynamic placeholder, which gets appended with a different GUID, and that way Sitecore basically identifies each placeholder. So it's not like so there is a way to basically identify each placeholder under specific section or frame, right? So basically we have something to identify that, okay, no, that yeah, this is the unique identifier for this particular frame. So I have Sitecore knows that for this particular placeholder it has to add this particular component with this data source. So there is, as long as there is something to identify, we are good. But that identification was missing in case of a regular placeholder. So now let me quickly publish these two changes. So if I just go ahead and publish, and then let me also go ahead and publish 2-column frame. Yeah, so publish is all done. So now what I'm going to do is, let me refresh it, and let me go to pages and insert generic page. Let me make it page 4. Okay, and let's go to experience editor. Right, and dynamic placeholders is something that is very specific to experience editor, because it will not be it will not be very easy for the content authors to add different components using dynamic placeholder, because it actually generates a GUID, which is not something which can be content authors can handle it. So that's the reason whenever we deal with dynamic placeholders, it all comes via experience editor, and then in case if there is something very static in nature, we can always go ahead with the content editor. We don't really need to go for the experience editor interface for that. Okay, so now what we have here is, we have created another page 4, which is again of generic page type, and if we click on that, what we see, we have a PS center placeholder, which is again a dynamic placeholder now, which means I can add as many components using this under this PS center, because this is also now a dynamic placeholder. So if I click on this add here, it gives me a flexibility to add as many components I want, but for this PS center the only allowed control was 2-column, which is nothing but a section or frame you can think of. So if I select this one, just click on select. So what this does is, like, we have header, we have footer, then under the body section we have this PS center. So under PS center, what we are trying to do is, we are trying to configure a 2-column frame, because that 2-column frame has left and right placeholder on it. So I think the page is still loading. Takes a while sometimes. Okay, so now what we can see here is we have left, we have right, which is again part of your, if you see there, like it is all part of your two columns, right? Because under two column only we have these two placeholders. So now what I really want to do here is let me add a component. So on the allowed control, which is set for ph left placeholder, is RTF. So let's go ahead, select it, and then you can specify the data source for it as well. Fine. So the next step would be to go to the right placeholder, which is again part of your two column frame. So just click on that, click on RTF and select, and then you can specify a different data source for that. So in this case it is home RTF, right? So now here what you can see here is, so far we have added under center. So if I have to correlate, so what we have done here is, under this PS center we have added two column frame, which has again two more placeholders, and we have configured two different components on left and right here. Now, so this was fine, even in case of if you go for regular placeholder also. But now again the problem is, let's say we have to add another instance of two column on the same page, right? Because it again has left and right. So because that was making it difficult to identify that which first of all which two column, and then which two column, which left and right exactly it has to configure the it has to identify the data source. So now, as we have we have already seen, like we have replaced that center placeholder to a dynamic placeholder. So in this case, if I want to let me just go to PS center, and let me add another two column, right? Because this you just remember, this PS center is now a dynamic placeholder, which means we can have as many frames we can add here with different data source. So I added another two column instance here, and now if I go here, if I can click on this, I select this, now we can have a different data source for that. So let me just select this one, and if I go on this, click on add here, and now select RTF, select the data source whatever you want, maybe personalized RTF, whatever it is, right? So now if you see, if you compare this page with what we had before, as soon as we added two different components, we had the same same data source added for both the frames, like frame 1 and frame 2, basically the same data source we had there. But now if you see, after adding this dynamic placeholders, we got a flexibility. We had this flexibility to add different data source for different frames. So now even if you want to add multiple instances of the of two column, and then you want to have a different component to your left and right, then you can easily do it via dynamic placeholders. So now if you see, the data source is completely different than what we had on first instance of two column, and then second instance of two column, right? So that is the advantage we get when we go for dynamic placeholders. And when we have to talk about the use case where we should go for what are the use cases where we should go for static placeholders, and the use cases where dynamic placeholders are more helpful. So the answer is, where you see the page is more static in nature, and then you don't have this kind of setup where under one placeholder you have another place, under one placeholder you are actually trying to configure one more kind of wrapper which has again set of different placeholders. So if you have this kind of requirement, then definitely it is not going to help you. If you go for regular placeholders, then you definitely have to go for dynamic placeholders. But if your page is very static in nature and doesn't have a very complex placeholders hierarchy, then maybe it just has a header and footer, and then one big placeholder, big container, and then inside that container you can just dump all your components with different data source. Definitely go for your regular placeholders, you really don't need dynamic placeholders there. But yes, if your placeholder hierarchy is too complex in nature, at least it is hierarchy, the hierarchy is there at least. And then again the hierarchy in the form like you have one page, then where you configure kind of wrapper, and that wrapper has again set of different placeholders, and you want to again have, you want to configure it multiple times onto your in your page. Then at that point of time it is very much required to go for dynamic placeholders, because if you go for regular placeholder, Sitecore will not be able to identify that which placeholders and which particular wrapper and placeholder it needs to use to configure the data source for that, which makes it very much easy in case of dynamic placeholder, because it generates the GUID which helps Sitecore to basically identify each and every placeholder when like it has to configure that component. So after adding these two wrappers and then with two different components also, if we go back to Sitecore, let's go back to Sitecore and just see how the presentation look for this particular page into presentation details. So let's go to file, layout, let me just click on save. Not sure if I have saved it. Okay, so now it is saved. Okay, let's go and let's go to page 4, presentation details. Right, yeah, so now you can see here what we see, like we have a different GUID which is attached to each place component, right? So basically this way Sitecore is able to identify that this particular component it has to use, and then this is the GUID for that. So this is basically a way for Sitecore to identify that which component it has to, which placeholder it has to go and configure the component with a different data source. So I think I'm pretty sure like some of you might already know about dynamic placeholders, but sometimes what I've seen is we know about dynamic placeholder, but when it comes to actually knowing how exactly it works in Sitecore, we sometimes struggle. So that's the whole point of having this topic as part of today's session. So I hope you liked it, and thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, any feedback, please feel free to ask it. And thanks for your time. Have a great day.